Novo Nordisk data for semaglutide in Alzheimer's were highly anticipated, but last week's readout for the GLP-1 therapy dashed what may have been long-shot hopes for a game changer in the disease. We'll discuss what the data mean in detail on this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. Plus, you've seen the headlines. Vinay Prasad is ready to deploy a new vaccine strategy at FDA. The impacts could be more far-reaching than has been reported. And cell and gene therapies have fallen off the radar for early-stage venture investors in the U.S. Why is that happening, and could there be hope across the Pacific? I'm Jeff Cranmer. Joining me today are my awesome colleagues.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
Steve Uston, Washington Editor.
And Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
All right. Well, I'm happy to be here with you guys. I know there's a lot of talk around JP Morgan every year about the weather we have here in California. I'm just happy to be home after, a lot of snow in Chicago. I got to say, much respect to the good folks that managed to get me and my family on a flight back to California. Steve, how were your travels? I know you were on the road.
People say Montreal is the, it's like if London and Paris had a child, it would be Montreal. And it lives up to it. It's great.
That's awesome. All right. Hopefully it was smooth. Dropping back down into the country. I guess they let you cross the border, which is always good. All right, let's talk a little Alzheimer's. Novo Nordisk's Alzheimer data were highly anticipated, and last week's readout dashed what may have been long-shot hopes for a game changer in Alzheimer's. Selena, for those of us who haven't been following this program so closely, can you tell us about the program and why there has been so much excitement around it?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Well, why is there so much hype? I mean, it's GLP-1. It's one of the hottest targets in the industry, undisputed for its efficacy in diabetes and now obesity and, big top-selling drugs where there's been these tantalizing signals across really a wide range of indications that maybe it's going to be effective in many settings, from sleep apnea, where it's relatively established, to things like addiction and Alzheimer's. And of course, Alzheimer's is a big financial opportunity for Novo. So in its mandate to maximize its profits from semaglutide, it would have been a big one. But alas, it will not be.
Selena, one of the things that, I wonder, and you wrote about this, was the decision to jump right into phase 3 trials. What are the consequences of that, or the implications of that for the Alzheimer's field more generally?
Yeah, that was the thing that stood out to me most about this program. So the reactions to this negative result have ranged from, what a predictable waste of resources, to, isn't it so wonderful that we have these robust, definitive data now, and everything in between. And what stood out to me about Novo's press release, and it's kind of been saying this all along, is that because it had lots of real-world data from use in diabetes patients, compelling preclinical data, and it knows some things about the mechanism, the semaglutide, although that is a complex mechanism that's only partially understood, that it had a, quote, responsibility to explore it in Alzheimer's. And on one hand, I kind of agree with that. I'm really glad they explored it in Alzheimer's. But what gave me some cognitive dissonance was that same release said that these studies had a low probability of success. And it's been saying that, acknowledging that all along the way. So if your studies have a low probability of success, do you really have a responsibility to recruit nearly 4,000 patients to answer the question?
Well, and the other thing is, you talk about the preclinical data, but wasn't the preclinical data suggestive of a protective effect, and the trial was in patients who already had Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so the real-world data that was so important for this program is in diabetes patients and some obesity patients, I guess, but primarily diabetes. And what it shows is that so diabetes is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, right? And the time to diagnosis of Alzheimer's in the real world data is delayed with semaglutide use. And semaglutide seems to be better at delaying Alzheimer's than some of the other treatments available for those patients. But yeah, when it came to testing it in phase 3, they jumped right into a setting where you're not talking about diabetes patients here. You're talking about Alzheimer's patients who are already symptomatic. So it's a pretty big leap. And I think patients are just a really valuable resource. And so if you're recruiting 4,000 of them to studies that you think have a low probability of success, when you could answer that question with a robust phase 2, like I'll say a 500 patient phase 2, which is what Johnson & Johnson just did with his anti-tau mAb, you can get a fairly definitive read on a product with a robust phase 2 in Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, Selena. So you wrote that recruitment and retention are just such bottlenecks for Alzheimer's, especially at a time when the therapeutic pipeline is broadening. So is it, maybe this is naive, but like, is this a super hardship on other companies?
Well, let's see. I mean, we'd have to get data on that to know for sure, right? But the pipeline has been expanding. It's not that there's a bunch of candidates in phase 3 that are highly promising. There aren't, but there's lots of early stage trials going on, testing, various neuroinflammatory mechanisms, for instance, and just things beyond amyloid and tau. I couldn't say if for certain that because 4,000 people were enrolled in this trial, it took X number of patients away from trial X or Y or Z. But there is this sense in which you think something is low probability of success. So you're kind of instilling false hope in far more patients than would strictly be necessary to ask your question. That's the part that kind of left me just wondering.
Yeah. Are there other GLP-1 programs for Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative diseases that you're looking out for?
Well, there have been along the way. Liraglutide has been tested. Several of the GLP-1s actually have been tested in different neurodegenerative disease settings. None of them have been an obvious success so far. Now, a lot of those studies have been kind of small, academic, early stage, right? So I get that you want something more robust than that to be definitive. There was a recent failure in Parkinson's that I think was pretty interesting. And I think right now, in terms of like getting the most learning out of this very robust trial that Novo ran, I'm very keen to see the CTAD presentation coming up this week, where the actual details of the data will be shared. When you do have this many patients, I think one of the positives, right, is that you can do a lot of subgroup analyses, and hopefully there was a robust set of biomarkers that were, employed, so we can do some hypothesis generation or learn whatever it is there is to be learned. So that's on the positive side of the ledger.
Cool. So this was last Monday before Thanksgiving. Big hit on Novo's shares, raised about 12 billion from its market cap. But J&J had some tough data too for its anti-tau program, yeah?
Yeah, sure did. So tau, I think we've all seen that there's been several failures of tau antibodies. There's sort of two hypotheses about tau is just a more complicated target than amyloid in a sense because it exists in lots of forms. It can be spliced in different ways. It can be phosphorylated at lots of different sites, individually or in combinations of phosphorylations. That it's thought to spread, like misfolded tau seeds are thought to spread extracellularly, but tau aggregates kind of wreak their havoc intracellularly. So exactly what form of tau to target where and when is just it's complicated, right? But there's really good reason to think that tau plays important roles in Alzheimer's, And so I think this is just a hypothesis that's going to continue to take time to test because it's not really one hypothesis. It has to be tested in all the various ways that kind of make sense. So what was interesting about this J&J antibody is that it targeted a mid-region part of tau that people thought was kind of the business end for this extracellular spreading hypothesis. The first, I think it was 4 mAbs that failed in phase 2 were all N-terminal targeting, and it's just not clear how important the N-terminal is for the escape of tau from where it first aggregates in the medial temporal lobe to its escape into the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe, which are very well timed with symptom onset and the character of those symptoms. Tau ends up in the frontal cortex, you get different symptoms than if it ends up in the parietal cortex, for instance. That's some of that data that makes you think tau is probably important. Anyway, the N-terminal ones failed. There's a lot of hope that these mid-region ones might be more useful. We now have 2, bepranemab from UCB and now posdinemab from J&J, that missed their endpoints. Still, the bepranemab data set was kind of interesting because it showed changes on tau PET. Now we're looking forward to a couple antibodies that bind specifically to the microtubule binding domain. There's still some C-terminal ones working their way through the clinic. I think the field is the prospects have certainly dimmed for blocking just the extracellular piece of tau being effective. I think people are most excited now about Biogen's BIIB080, which is an antisense program with Ionis that just knocks down tau, right? It's at the mRNA level. You stop producing it. So you're going to block all of those forms. And Biogen was able to show that could actually reduce some of the tau pathology, not just stop progression of getting more neurofibrillate tangles, but like reverse some of them. That was pretty exciting early data. So I think all eyes will be watching that next year when they report more data.
All right. Well, you can see Selena's story up on our website, biocentury.com, biocenturypodcast.com. I'll drop a link into the show notes. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back and talk about what is happening with FDA's new vaccine policy.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. An arc of innovation is emerging across Asia, and Western biopharma leaders are taking note, from cross-border deals to new co's. In March 2026, the 5th BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit visits South Korea for the first time. Meet the biopharma leaders putting Korea innovation on the global map. Learn why Korea has become a clinical trial and manufacturing hub. Discover if Korea is the next hotspot for new co-formation. Plus meet biopharma innovators from India to Singapore to China and Japan. Register now at biocenturyeastwest.com.
Okay, we're back. Yes, we are getting close to the BioCentury East-West Summit in Seoul. I am pressing Josh, our guru behind our conferences, hard to have an event tied to Norabong. That is Korea's answer to karaoke. So you should sign up to be a delegate. If you're interested in presenting, we are recruiting companies from across Asia's arc of innovation, from Europe, from the US, from Canada. Reach out to me via LinkedIn or go to our website and submit your interest in being a presenting company for the 5th BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit in Seoul. Okay, vaccines have been in the spotlight more than ever since RFK Jr. became head of HHS. Now, Vinay Prasad, head of FDA's CBER, wants to change how vaccines are regulated. He claims that a new review has tied 10 children's death to the COVID vaccine. Steve, I know you've been working the phones over the weekend. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so Vinay Prasad and FDA Commissioner Marty Makary are using disputed analyses that purport to link COVID vaccines to pediatric deaths to justify a set of policies that would make it really difficult to create new vaccines and especially to update existing vaccines in response to emerging threats or evolving pathogens. So Prasad and Makary, as you said, they've asserted that COVID vaccines caused the deaths of at least 10 children. That conclusion, they haven't provided the data to support it. It's at odds with investigations that were conducted during the Biden administration. A senior CDC Epidemic Intelligence Service officer and an FDA pharmacovigilance staffer reviewed all the pediatric deaths that were reported to the agency as being possibly related to COVID vaccines and determined that none were definitively or probably caused by vaccines. That's what 2 former senior agency officials told me. I think that what's even more important is that this conclusion about the pediatric deaths is being used as a lever to roll out contentious vaccine policies policies that are really going to change the way the vaccines are developed. So in the memo, which was released at 4:21 on the Friday following Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Prasad said that FDA is no longer going to allow manufacturers to rely on immunogenicity surrogates and will require pre-market randomized controlled trials for most vaccines. He also indicated that FDA will revise the framework for approving annual flu vaccines and that it's reassessing the safety of multi-vaccine administration. These are going to have profound effects on vaccine development, as I said, and some of the concerns are also around how these policies have been developed and rolled out. They've been developed by political appointees in secret. There's been no advisory committee meeting. There's been no opportunity for discussion among the scientific and the medical community about these changes. And in his memo, Prasad also basically told CBER staff that it's his way or the highway, that if they don't agree with the actions that he's taken, that they should resign. This is also unprecedented at FDA.
So, Steve, what would this have looked like if these had been in effect in the past?
Well, yeah, and that's a good way to look at it, to understand what it's going to mean going forward. So, for example, the HPV vaccines that are making eradication of cervical cancer a real possibility wouldn't have happened if these policies had been in place. Neither would Ebola vaccines, and the chikungunya vaccines that are under development. All those would be impossible because they all rely to a critical extent, on immunobridging studies. So, for example, Gardasil, the leading HPV vaccine, was approved based on a large trial that showed high efficacy against virologic endpoints and high-grade cervical precancer in placebo-controlled trials in young adult women. Placebo-controlled trials in early adolescence weren't practical or ethical, so the licensure was extended to younger age groups, to 9 to 15-year-olds, and dosing changes approved based on immunobridging. Regulators accepted vaccination in adolescents because their antibody responses were non-inferior to those seen in adults in whom clinical efficacy was demonstrated.
So where do we go from here, Steve?
It's really unclear. I think that this is part of a broader assault on vaccination. It's not a coincidence that this memo was sent out just a few days ahead of the next ACIP meeting. The members that were in ACIP, most of them were fired, and they were replaced by individuals who were on board with Robert F. Kennedy's Make America Healthy Again ideology. They're going to be meeting this week, likely to discuss and recommend changes to the pediatric vaccine schedule, changes in vaccine formulation that will make it difficult to approve new vaccines and could result in removing existing vaccines from the market. Martin Kulldorff has just been named to a senior position at HHS. So I think we're seeing this really broad kind of movement across government to implement policies that are going to result in reduced access to existing vaccines and a halt or at least an enormous slowdown in the development of future vaccines. Now, there's also going to be, of course, there's going to be a backlash against this from the public health community, and it isn't clear how it's all going to be resolved. The other thing I think that's important also is that it's going to have effects outside of vaccines. The climate of fear and top-down management at CBER isn't restricted to vaccines, and I think it's going to have effects on CBER's ability to function more broadly.
And very recently, we asked you all out there on your views on how things are going at FDA, what you like, what you don't like, where things are headed across various domains, including vaccines. So we are busy analyzing that now, and stay tuned for the results probably next week.
And we should note that Prasad's memo does not name any specific company. It's just the vaccine that allegedly caused these kids' deaths. That said, stocks of vaccine companies are down today. A few notable ones: Vaxcyte down 8 as we recorded, Moderna 6, BioNTech 5. We'll see how this plays out. And keeping with the upbeat news, Lauren, you've got a story coming out on funding for cell and gene therapy companies. It doesn't look good for early stage investments in these plays in the US. What's behind the negative sentiment?
Yeah, this won't be very uplifting either. And it's not just one thing that's behind the negative sentiment. So there have been patient deaths this year linked to AAV gene therapies, the ongoing manufacturing, logistical access problems around cell therapies, CAR T cells in particular, have just made a difficult business case for advancing some of those. The challenges of moving CAR Ts beyond hematological malignancies, and some competitive dynamics that we've talked about recently between some of the gene editing technologies and different modalities are also just contributing to general negative sentiment for cell and gene therapies. I took a look at the number of seed and Series A rounds closed this year relative to recent years, dating back to 2020, to see how all of this is reflecting, new company formation and that early stage venture funding that's going into these technologies. And in terms of the absolute number of rounds, it's very few have happened this year. So, the year is not over. Of course, venture funding has been down overall this year. So that's maybe not surprising, but there were almost no AAV gene therapy seed and Series A rounds in the US this year, for example. And then looking at these as a percentage of the number of overall seed and Series A rounds for biotech, it was pretty striking. So each of the last 5 years cell and gene therapies have captured like 17 to 20% of these early stage rounds. It was 12% overall based on the data that we have in BCIQ for 2025 so far. And then when you look just at the rounds in the US, it was a little higher historically. Cell and gene therapies were about 17 to 21%, and it was only 7% this year. So there is a big drop off in what we've seen over the past years when these two modality classes have just been exploding, but interest is definitely way down.
I'm wondering if the ones we are seeing this year, this is cell and gene, I'm wondering if they're mostly in vivo CAR T or if they cluster in certain areas, like the ones that can make it through to actually get funding right now.
Sure. So I was actually surprised that in vivo CAR T didn't necessarily stand out as like the modality that's getting funding. It's been pretty consistent over the period that I was watching with the number of rounds for in vivo CAR T cell companies. So this is actually something that's been funded back to 2022. There were a few this year. The number of rounds was so small that it was hard to pick out trends of what exactly is in the funding. But some of the things that were notably absent were AAV gene therapies in the US in particular, and immune cell therapies were down. CAR T cells in particular were down. And so all of the CAR T cell funding that we saw in the past, seed and Series A funding in the past 2 years, 2024 and 2025, was really focused on new indications and expanding access for that modality. So it's all allogeneics, gamma deltas, ways to make these more accessible, and then tweaks to the design that may make the cell therapies work in solid tumors, which is something that we haven't really seen yet. So multiple targets or armoring the cells with cytokines and things like that.
All right, Lauren, that's all in the US. Is there hope overseas? We know we've been following China closely. What's it looking like in China?
So in China, the proportion of seed and Series A rounds that we have data covering is really exploding for cell and gene therapy since about 2021. So I mentioned that it was only 7% in the US. It was 29% based on the data that we have, which may not be entirely complete. So a big difference in the level of focus that these modalities are getting in China. And something that I found really interesting was that the specific technologies that are getting funded at Chinese biotechs are not what I was expecting. So NK cells were a very hot area. This is a type of immune cell therapy that has had a lot of negative sentiment in the US in particular and in Europe in the past couple of years, just because there's been some evidence that an NK cell, a CAR NK, may not be as effective or as durable as a CAR T cell. We've seen deals that are dissolved, we've seen programs dropped, but it seems like some biotechs in China are sort of taking on the challenge of figuring out how to make this cell type work. There's also a lot of development of AAV gene therapies, which I mentioned. We're not seeing a lot of early stage funding for companies that are specifically working on that in the US. There are a lot working on it in China. So, the regulatory environment obviously is different there than here. One of the contributors to negative sentiment in the US that I didn't mention is all of the uncertainty around how FDA will handle rare and ultra-rare diseases going forward. So that may contribute to the fact that we're seeing a lot of innovation there in other regions.
Lauren, with the commercial challenges in the US for cell and gene therapies formidable, what does the path look like for these Chinese companies? Because I would think a lot of them would be hoping for overseas partners to really, take these therapies into lucrative markets. I know pricing pressure within China is pretty intense. So what's the commercial dynamics and the pull look like over there?
That's a good question. I don't think we have the answer, but I know that what we've seen with cell therapies, I think, is what we may see with gene therapies. So it's possible to get clinical proof of concept for a cell and gene therapy in China through an IIT in a way that's, potentially faster and less expensive than what may be possible to do in a US-based phase 1 trial. I think ultimately the hope may be a US-based partner, and de-risking an asset for a rare or ultra-rare disease in a way that changes the economics enough to make Western companies willing to take on the risk.
All right. Well, any hope of this changing in the near term in the US, Lauren? Well, what's it going to take? Are there any products you're watching that might give a much needed win?
We've talked about this before too, but as we mentioned earlier on this podcast, I think the in vivo CAR Ts are something that everyone's watching because there's good early proof of concept data from a very small number of patients. But this is a potential to solve the access issues of a really effective modality for cancer and potentially autoimmune diseases too. That could bring this cell therapy product into more patients, more indications.
And one company I just say maybe have a look at, Immuneel, founded by Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw. She's the founder of Biocon, the most successful biotech company in India. She partnered up with a couple of other Indian KOLs and launched Immuneel, which aims to bring CAR Ts to patients at a fraction of the cost. I've had the CEO on a couple of my East-West panels lately, and, he says that they're making progress. So that's one to watch as well. Steve, you spoke to them back in the day, yeah?
Yeah, and they have an interesting model for developing CAR Ts and for providing them to patients, basically looking at producing CAR Ts in hospitals, something akin to the way that transplants are handled in the United States.
Look, a lot of this stuff doesn't work until it works. And hardworking people like many of our listeners, they brought you KRAS after how many years? 40 years. And just got to keep going at it. All right. Well, don't miss our sister podcast coming out later this week, the BioCentury Show. Selena will be sitting down with the CEO of 4 Biotherapeutics. That's Bill Hinshaw. And also on biocentury.com, we have our colleague Lindsay Martin's analysis of Series A rounds. Worth checking out, and we will catch you next Monday. Don't forget to like and subscribe, send us a question, and we will see you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.